All right, so today we're talking about trauma and attachment.
There you go.
Yeah, it could be intense.
Well, you could be an expert.
Yeah, I think we're all an expert
Yes,
in
of course.
trauma and attachment, whether I think some of us are not consciously aware of it or not, but we've all gone through and continue to go through trauma and attachment. I guess the first step would be to define trauma, which I mean, to me, trauma is wounds. And they're not visible. You know, like you get physical wounds, you have those wounds for life, you have scars in that build. But when we talk about emotional trauma, we talk about wounds that occur over situations that you've been involved in, things that have been done to you. You know, anytime there's any kind of, I guess, I'm going to use the word trauma, but I can't use the word trauma. But anytime there's something that happens to you that affects your well-being, that affects who you are, whether it's emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually, that you then carry on that wound for the rest of your life. And
Kind of like a scar. Like I've got lots of scars from sports, right? You get hit, a wound happens, you heal it, and then over time you have a little memory there, a little scar there that, you know, sometimes you'll bring up again.
Right. And it's hard because you can't see these types of wounds. And so we disregard them. And that's what I refer to as unresolved trauma. So you haven't even healed that wound because you're not even aware it's there. And you go through life and, you know, then you experience certain things that don't feel right. And you're confused at the things you're attracting in life. And it's due to those wounds that haven't been healed. And like you said, even if you've healed them, there's scars. And sometimes those scars require you to go back and pay attention to them. And there's something called, you know, I kind of relate this to PTSD because when you have wounds that are unresolved, you're gonna continue to replay the situations, whether subconsciously or consciously.
Like Groundhog Day, right?
All the time.
And over and over again, and then you're like, why does this keep happening?
Yeah, and it'll continue to happen until you go back and you visit that wound and you start to get to the root of why it occurred and heal the emotions that are associated with it. And that's a hard thing to do. I think probably the majority of the population would rather keep going, sweep it under the carpet and live their life, but ultimately you can't live a wholesome life until you address your trauma. It's really the root to who you are, who you decide to be, and every behavior that comes out of that. And it's not an easy process. I mean, that's why we're starting this podcast. That's why we're trying to help people, because it's really about identifying your trauma and healing it. And then we drew attachment, or the bowl drew attachment for us.
Yes, of course.
And of course, like to me, those are synchronous.
Yeah, they kind of work hand in hand. Like I worked with so many different people, and there's lots of different levels of trauma. Mm-hmm. And I think the biggest thing I get a lot in my life with people, especially with women and guys, is relationships trauma, right? So a lot of the time they'll get in a relationship and they're in an abusive relationship or a toxic relationship for them. And then they leave that person and they're like, oh, the next guy's going to be different. And then it's the same repeating pattern. Yeah. And if you look back at over time, you can see like where that first started. Usually you start at a very young age and boom, something that kind of triggered that, and it kind of keeps looping. And then they start associating with that, like, this is my identity. Mm-hmm. This is like, I'm attached to this type of behavior.
Right.
I got a friend recently, like she's in her 40s, just got out of another relationship. And if we looked at all her past, like 20 years of dating, it's the same thing. And she goes, why? And I'm like, well, maybe you need to go for a different style of guy. And the first thing she did, she tried that, and she dated a guy that was completely opposite. And then she even felt like, this is weird to me. Like, it's not, I don't like this. I was like, no, you're not used to that, right? So it's something that we always are going to constantly face until we finally say, this is what's causing this to happen.
And that is the hard work, right? No one wants to go back and feel the pain of their past. And ultimately, the only way to let go of those wounds and allow them to heal is you have to go back and you have to feel the pain and relive those situations and let yourself feel what you needed to feel that you didn't feel that caused the wound. And so, and attachment, there's attachment to everything. You can have attachment to behaviors, to people, to experiences, to things, to food, to just about everything.
Goals, even businesses.
Yeah. And attachment is really born out of trauma, because when you have trauma, you have an emptiness. There's a void in you that you're trying to fill, whether you're consciously aware of it or not. And so the immediate Band-Aid effect is to become attached to things, thinking, like the example you use, thinking that a new person with a new attitude is going to fill that void. Yeah. And ultimately it never does, because you have to heal the trauma that has caused the wound before you can move on. And I think, like, for me, one of the greatest goals in life is to be devoid of any attachment, because when you start to get attached to things and you start grieving the loss of things, you're really creating this situation where there's an incompleteness within you, and you're just grasping to try to fill that emptiness, but you'll never fill it. It's like digging a hole while water's being poured into it. Like, you're never going to get ahead.
Yeah, everyone kind of goes through different times and different things in life, and you can look at your own life and everyone can do the same and see it. Like, I've even had friends of mine, like businesses, right? One guy had broken up with a girl and he was really devastated over that. And he's like, you know what? She left me because I was broke. That was what happened. Now he's super wealthy and he's still like not there, like he's still thinking like, man, like my life feels empty inside. I'm like, well, because you didn't address what was really going on there, you used the money and the business as a mask to that. And now you feel alone. You feel like you don't feel good. You're not happy. He's always angry. And I'm like, if somebody has all these resources and all this success, you would think they'd be in a good place. But now he's starting to realize like, man, why did I even go down this path? Like, because I thought it would heal my trauma. And in reality, now, like, my life sucks. And he calls me all the time, like, what do I do here? And I'm like, well, you've kind of, created that Band-Aid approach and not really figured out what was going on at that time. And you've used, your business, your work, your lifestyle as your thing. And now you're coming to that realization that, man, I really got to think about what I want moving forward with my life. Right?
Well, I think attachments become distractions, right? And we often get attached to the thought and the expectations we create. Of
course.
We don't actually get attached to the present moment or the present situation, because you can't be present if you have an extreme amount of wounds that have been unresolved, right? So people often get attached. You meet someone, you start going into this thought process of what it could be. And let's say it doesn't work out. Well, you're not mourning the loss of that person. You're mourning the loss of the thoughts and the ideas that you had surrounding that. And I think we often, when we have unresolved trauma, we're looking to be saved because we don't want to do the work ourselves, whether we're going to consciously acknowledge that or not. We're looking to get distracted because, again, nobody wants to go back and relive that pain. And often it is from our childhood experiences under the age of 9. So some people go through, hypnosis and other strategies to try to dig out those moments. And I mean, you can do them on your own. They're not easy to do, but they do get you to the place that you can start to resolve your trauma and not create attachment, challenges for yourself where you're starting to get attached to things to try to heal yourself, because it's not going to heal. It's really just going to distract you until, and no one wants to feel grief. No one wants to mourn the loss of things. It makes you feel less worthy, makes you feel incomplete. And the solution is to heal your trauma. And again, that's a hard thing that I think a lot of people are challenged in doing. And I mean, is there a strategy? There's many strategies out there.
There's tons of things. I do something that's really weird. I'll show a story. So I remember one time I was dating this girl and I really thought, this girl is going to be, that person for me, right? And then she cheated on me and left. And I was like really upset about that, obviously, because I was like, had a different expectation of how this was going to go. And so in those moments, I'm thinking like, this happened to me a few times, like what's going on? And I know some of the things I was obviously not 100% in certain areas and vice versa. So there's always relationship things, but you just got to dig a little bit deeper. So what I do, just kind of random, I went to Chapters, the bookstore, and I closed my eyes and I just went in front of like the personal development section because I do this. And I reached forward and I pulled out that book that I always talk about, like letting go.
Yeah.
And I like blew my mind because that whole book's premise was how to deal with attachment issues in a sense, right?
Yeah.
Like even with goals, like I was saying, I want to earn this amount of money and I keep going. If I don't get there, like you feel so distraught. And so this book's idea of saying, well, sometimes you just need to let it go and be present. And then if it's supposed to happen, it will happen, still work, but don't have this huge expectation. This is the weight on that thing.
And detach
from the outcome. Even in relationships, people get so like, this person's my everything. Like I was in a relationship where, that person wouldn't, take care of themselves properly. Would always depend on me for everything. And like, you've got to be good on your own and bring value to it and not always be waiting for that person to guide and lead you all times of life. So certain people go through different things, but I found that one book really helped me understand myself a bit more and get over that attachment issue. And it could be from anything from relationships, business. Is really the sky's the limits with it.
Well, when you can let go of your attachments, and the whole methodology they use is you have to feel what you're feeling and allow those feelings to come through, good or bad, so that your body can heal. And the only way to heal is just allow the feelings. Don't suppress, don't repress, don't overexpress, don't distract, just be with those feelings. And then you start to move through them, kind of like weathering the storm. You kind of have to go through the storm, right? So I agree. That book is phenomenal in teaching, feel what you need to feel. That's how you let it go. And then don't focus on that outcome. Don't get attached to the outcome. Set your intention and trust that it's going to manifest without creating this codependency. And we see that often. And you kind of mentioned that in that relationship. There's a codependency because there's wounds and you're looking for some sort of distraction to create an attachment so that you don't have to deal with wounds. But it's really counterproductive. I mean, one thing I do when it comes to trauma I use triggers as my lesson. So anytime I'm triggered, which means I get like a visceral, emotional, or even physical response, it's usually negative in a moment. It could be to a person, a situation, or whatever it is where I'm triggered and I'm like, ugh, this doesn't feel right. To me, that's a great opportunity to pay attention because there's usually trauma there. And whether I'm interested in dealing with it in that moment, if I pay attention and even journal it, I can go back to that and know that there's a wound here that needs to be resolved. So I think for me, it's also, in that moment when I'm triggered, identifying what am I attached to? And so if I can figure out what am I attached to and then ask myself, or ask myself, what would it be easy to let go of? Or what would be challenging to let go of in my life? And if I list things, I'm like, okay, so I have attachments to these things. And then the next question is, what for? Why am I attached to these things? What am I looking to get from them, right? And then again, being aware of the outcome and saying, okay, can I detach from this outcome? And it's really just asking yourself those deep questions and being honest with yourself. So I start with a trigger and then I ask myself, what am I attached to this for? And then just build on that. And you get to the root emotion of why am I attached to this? Well, I need a sense of feeling worthy. Okay, well, there it is. So there's obviously a wound when it comes to self-worth that needs to be addressed.
Of course.
I mean, it's a process like everything.
But I always like the saying, like, you come on this planet with nothing and you leave with nothing.
Right.
So if you have that mentality going into life, you really shouldn't create too much of an attachment to things, relationships, people in general. It's experiences. Right. And so I've even seen this with myself. Like I've always had dreams. I want to be in exotic cars and sports cars. And when I worked with Bob and even some of the companies I consulted, I got to drive all those dream cars and be around them. And it's fun, right? I'm like, oh my God, I want one of these. And what's crazy is you talk to people that have it, they say they're bored with it. They're done with it, right? I'm like, what? Like, did you work so hard to get it? Yeah, I achieved this goal, but now I'm like, okay. Right? So it's like, well, why did you kill yourself for something when it's not even really something you realized you even wanted when you got there? And that happens so often with goals. Yeah. Even in fitness, this is funny. I had a lady that wanted me to help her lose weight. I lost all of her weight and got her in great shape. And then she still got mad at me because she went for a procedure to dislocate fat in the body. You could take fat from your hips, put it in her face. And she was mad at me because she didn't have enough fat in her body to fill her cheeks. So I'm like, I gave you what you wanted. Yeah. And you're so fixated on it. Yeah. You got there and then went to something else and then now you're unhappy. So you're always not happy with what you're getting for her in that term. She's always looking at everything and being, she gets it like, I don't want this and wants to change it. And that's where her brain kind of goes through sometimes when we start to think on things to fix
it's like
stuff.
You're chasing your tail, right? Because that, again, creating that attachment is not going to heal the wound. So as soon as you've achieved that, whatever that which you were attached to, it's not going to be fulfilling because you now need another distraction. So you're almost upset that you've achieved that goal because you're like, oh, now I need another distraction. I need to set another goal. And it's this vicious cycle of unfulfillment until you go and identify the wounds that have led to those attachments. And then you sit with the pain of those wounds and you heal them. And again, I understand why people don't do it. It's the hardest.
It is very hard. And it's even like with goals, people say, wait a minute, Chris, you're saying like don't set goals then, because that's usually what I get now. Wait a minute, I must be attached. Well, then why am I setting the goal? Well, the goal is there to tell you to grow.
And direct you.
And direct you somewhere to something. Because our brains are always constantly focusing on more and more and more. Yeah. Right? We see that with consumerism. We see that with how big debt is acquired on the planet. So our brains are always going to be going that way and thinking that way. But it's the skills you learn in that, the stuff you learn about yourself in that process that allows you to be who you are. And so if you're not striving towards something and just being like a couch potato, then what's really the point of living? You should have some stuff. But you can't be so hyper-fixated on it where that's everything. And I can even look at this with very famous people. Like I looked at Steve Jobs as an example, right? He's created Apple, done a lot of great things before he left. But he was so hyper-fixated on that. Look how fast he left this planet, right? He probably didn't take care of his health. He probably didn't focus on those things. He was very high-strung, very high-stress, very demanding. And we see that with all high achievers. They're like that over time. And they're so fixated on the goal, and they do get there. But then there's problems that come from being that way too. Yeah. So there's always, that balance of the good and evil, I guess you'd say, that comes with venturing on paths like that.
And it always goes back to trauma. If it's unresolved, that it will manifest itself in these different situations that regardless of how famous you are and how successful you are, people still go through these moments of attachment, and it's because they haven't identified and dealt with their trauma. And again, it's not a fun thing to do, to go back to your childhood. Even for me, identifying triggers. Yeah, some days it's overwhelming because I'm triggered a million times in one day. However, that's good stuff because that's the stuff that's going to help me heal if I'm willing to pay attention.
And you have to do the work. And most people, they get very distracted. And distraction come in a variety of different ways. Like we've seen it with celebrities who, huge amounts of drugs or sex addiction
Or social media. I mean, you can just distract yourself all day by
all day long.
social media.
You never really face your stuff, and other things control how you live. And that to me is not really living. It's kind of survive.
It is, So, I mean, I think it's really important for people to start to pay attention to, what's going on in their world, what they're being triggered in, and to start to pay attention to their trauma and whether they're willing to address and acknowledge it in that moment, or even just paying attention to it. That's the first step. As soon as you can say, you know what, I'm doing this because I have this trauma. I had these attachments because I have this trauma. That's the first step. And that in itself will create such great healing. Then the next step is to go visit that trauma and to start to sit with the pain of that trauma so that you're not creating these attachments. Because I mean, even for myself, I don't know how many times I got attached to situations. It's hard to always be mourning the loss of something. And then it's like, wait a second, what am I really attached to here? So it's a process, and I hope that people take it seriously. And if they really want to create exciting lives where they can be present and they don't have this attachment, because the goal in life is really to be devoid of any attachment, to be free, and that you're literally living in your present moment and enjoying everything in its presence. You can't do that if you're attached to things. So, that's the goal. And if people want to try to get there, my recommendation is to start paying attention to your trauma and making notes about it and starting to heal as you're willing to.
And then trying to figure out what are those things. Like people used to come to me all the time, be like, yeah, I do. A lot of people come to me with problems, and I listen to their problems, and then I usually have a solution. And sometimes it's like just recommending maybe a book that they read or something.
Yeah.
And so I remember all the time, I train a lot, work with a lot of females. They'll come to me with a lot of self-esteem issues, right? And so a great book that I recommend them to read is Psycho-Cybernetics by Maxwell Maltz. And that book is written by a plastic surgeon, and he pretty much went through and he's like, I've done all these procedures on men and women to change their physical appearance, and I do that for them, and then they're still not happy.
Yeah.
Right. And so he's like, what's going on here? Right. And so he would actually uncover their trauma before he would do any procedures, figure out, is this something that actually needs to be done, or is it some other demon you're battling right now? And that's not going to fulfill you or make you happy.
Right.
Like, I think there was this part of the story where a lady had like something wrong with her nose, and she said it was affecting her ability to sell or something like that. And he's like, it's not your lip. That's the problem. It's you. And so sometimes people will find something else to mask it.
Well, yeah.
And so usually I tell people to check out that book if you kind of go with, have some problems looking at yourself and feeling comfortable in your own skin. It's a really great book for people to understand themselves a bit better. I
agree. Because it, again, goes back to you want to be distracted. You don't want to deal with it. So again, if you want to live a great life and the life that's suited to who you are and who you want to be, you got to heal that trauma.
Yeah, that's the only way to do it. Fortunately, there's no shortcut or cheat code to it.
No.
Just do the work.
You have to do the work. So that's our chat for today on trauma and attachment. Hopefully people will find some healing in this. I hope they do, because it does help you live a better life.